If you've played the 2D platformer Pizza Tower, then you already know that it's marinated in a 90s retro sauce. It's heavily inspired by Nicktoons, and it pays homage to games like Wario Land 4 and Sonic the Hedgehog. But for an indie game so new, how does a bedroom composed score sound so nostalgic? Let's dive into it. Pizza Tower is made by a company called Tour de Pizza and is composed by Mr. Sauceman alongside Classy Gito. The thing I found most surprising about this OST is its apparent use of sampling. There's been no efforts to hide, mangle, or manipulate the origin of these sounds. So when you hear the "Hello There" vocal from Wario Land 4 or the bass line from Chrono Trigger, you're immediately transported back to a simpler time when you only had to worry about starting Pokemon Red with either Squirtle or Charmander. No one started with Bulbasaur. In fact, the sample list in Pizza Tower is so vast, a community has put an entire Google Doc together tracking each of the song's instruments and samples. I'll leave it in the description below. It's in this Google Doc that I made my next discovery. How do you go about using these sounds once you source them? And what the hell is an SF2 file? So essentially, an SF2 is better known as a sound font file. They were highly popular in the 90s and early 2000s, and they're basically a tiny snippet of a real-world instrument that can be stored on a card reader so it can be read by a synthesizer. These small files can be manipulated and combined to make a lot of the famous video games of the 90s and noughties, and most of them can be found online. Once those files have been downloaded, however, they do need to be converted. I found the easiest way to do this was to convert them to WAV. Don't worry, those compositional elements of the video are coming real soon. To convert them to WAV, I use Sforzanzo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a free download and converts those files for you so that they're playable in your DAW of choice. You can see here I imported SF2s across a whole bunch of games, from Battletoads to Kirby, Wario Land, and more. And that's one of the reasons that Pizza Tower sounds so good. It's squashing so many pieces of reminiscent content that you heard on loop as a kid into yet another monotonous but cleverly crafted piece of composition. So now that we know where the tonal aspects of the track come from, how do we go about composing the musical elements? This episode is sponsored by DistroKid, by the way, and I'll have more on them at the end of this episode. This is a huge project for a change, so I'm going to focus on the main elements that I found in Pizza Tower. If you want to download the entire Ableton project as it's seen in this video, or the STEM session to better dissect and sample in your own music, then just head over to the Patreon. But if you're sticking around, we're going to need to decide on a motif. A motif is a basic repeating pattern. For this piece, my motif is C, G, and G sharp. And you'll hear that in different instrumental variations and at different tempos throughout this piece of music. It's better to decide on something simple for your motif, as it's going to be heard so often. Now, you probably know that in popular music, we're often using the C major scale, and that's almost true for a lot of popular video games of the 90s as well. But in stylistically niche games like The Mask, Earthworm Jim, and Comic Zone, we're hearing a lot of blues scales mixed in too. To transform a normal scale into a blues scale, we need to flatten the third, the fifth, and the seventh notes of the scales. Our normal C major scale sounds like this, but a blues scale sounds like this. We don't often use the second and the sixth notes of the scale. The great thing about Pizza Tower is it slowly lets you in on the motif and builds the music out from there, whilst increasing the tempo and drip feeding you those pockets of nostalgia that you've once heard before. As the tempo kicks into high gear, we're using a lot of timpani and percussive elements alongside our acoustic sampled elements. You might hear noise in place of hi-hats, but in Pizza Tower, they're using both. Just like the contrast of the drums, we've got two types of guitar sound as well. The power chords patch used from Battletoads, and we're also mixing in live guitar to give it a more doom-like anthemic soundtrack. I don't play guitar, so I've used Ample Sound's Hellraiser VST. There's some really great effects used in Pizza Tower to add urgency and stress to the player. These effects can be achieved by increasing the tempo, as we suggested at the beginning of the tutorial. Another way to achieve this, also heard in Pizza Time, is the rising of pitch. To do this in Ableton, I just resampled everything you've just heard and then added the shifter. That was set to the fine tune, and then I kind of pitched that little clip up over time. This is a fantastic way to transition into the next change of your piece of music. You can hear in this section of music, I've also sampled Wario's voice to again crowbar in some more nostalgia into this OST. The thing that Pizza Tower does really well, especially in Pizza Time, is to change the phrases so regularly so that you're hearing that motif time and time again, but on different instruments. I'll give you an example of what you can hear in the Patreon version of this track. This was a lot of fun. I know that some of my friends are releasing video game inspired beat tapes, and if you're thinking about doing the same thing, then I would suggest releasing your music through DistroKid. In my opinion, they're the fastest and most helpful distributor out there, and with my link in the description below, you can get 7% off your first year. But that's just me, and we're at the end of today's episode. How did you find it? What do you want to see in future episodes, and how are you? Have you drank enough water? How you doing? If you've been with me for a while, I want to let you know I'm approaching my 300th episode, and as I crawl my way to that next checkpoint, I noticed that only 22% of my audience is subscribed. So if you want to see this channel grow and help make bigger and better videos, then please do hit that famous or maybe infamous button that you've heard so much about. I thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.